unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. One of the most remarkable episodes in modern Indian history is the story of how the leaders of over 550 sovereign princely states were convinced that they should give up their independence to become a part of a free India. This monumental task of accession was carried out over weeks, not months and not years. But accession, it turned out, was just the first step in an ongoing drama between India's princes and the rulers of the Indian Republic, a drama that would unfold over the next many decades. A new book, Dethroned, Patel, Menon, and the Integration of Princely India, captures this incredible story in almost cinematic fashion. The book's author is John Zabriskie, an Australia-based writer who has worked in India as a diplomat, foreign correspondent, before becoming a full-time author. To talk more about his new book, John joins me today from his home in Sydney. John, congrats on the book, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Milan. I'm thrilled to be on your podcast. I'm an avid listener, and I hope my story adds to your great list so far.
Well, thank you very much for that. I want to ask you a little bit about why you set out to write this book. You note in the prologue that there is both a wealth of archival material now, as well as a wealth of scholarship on the princely states and on the princes themselves. Just last year, I had Rahul Sagar on the show to talk about his terrific book, The Progressive Maharaja. But you saw an opening with Dethroned to fill a gap in our knowledge about this period of Indian history. What was that opening that you saw?
Look, there are several reasons why I thought this book was essential. We could talk about it for most of the podcast, I think. But look, it is the first book that looks at the accession of the princely states to India, the process that, as you say, took place not in the space of just a few months, but in the space of a few weeks, but then carries the story forward to what happened after independence, after the transfer of power. And then it also carries a story forward to the ultimate demise of the princely order when Indira Gandhi abolished the privy purses and their privileges in 1971. And I also include a chapter on what happened to the 10 or 12 princely states that found themselves within the borders of Pakistan. So, as well as giving a background to the princely states, what they were, how they were ruled, the relationship between them and the paramount power or the British, I also, try and give a comprehensive account. I mean, as you say, there have been books written before, and I mentioned them in my introduction on the princely states. Ian Copland, who's an Australian academic, wrote The Princes of India and the Endgame of Empire, which is a terrific work. There are books by Stephen Ashton, Barbara Rumelsack, but all of these works only take the story up to independence. They don't go any further. And more recently, there's been a wealth of scholarship coming out of India on various princely states. And you mentioned Rahul Sagar's the Progressive Maharaja, which talks about Madhav Rao, who was the Diwan of Travancore, Indore, and Baroda around the late 19th, early 20th century. And Manu Pillai is another fine Indian author who's written on Travancore and some of the other princely states as well. But again, I saw a gap in the scholarship on something that was comprehensive, that looked at the story as a whole. And I think the other reason why I wanted to do this book was to correct the narrative around the accession of the states. Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the States Minister, and we'll be talking about him, I'm sure, a lot more in this podcast, described this process of accession as a bloodless revolution. And if you look at what happened, it was anything but bloodless. The other thing I wanted to correct was that the narrative that most people have accepted on the accession and integration of the states was that authored by V.P. Menon, who was Patel's deputy. his book, The Story of the Integration of the Princely States, was his account of the process, because he was there. He was in the pilot's seat, if you like. But again, it only provides one side of the story. So, there is, there was a lot of gaps, I thought, to fill in.
Many of our listeners would have a sense of this, but some of them may not. I would love for you to just kind of step back for a second and characterize for us where things stood in India on the eve of the kind of independence moment. How much territory did the British actually control? How much was governed by the princes? What was life in princely India like? How did it differ from what life was like in the British-controlled parts?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you looked at a map of the pre-partition Indian subcontinent, you would see this almost like jigsaw puzzle layout of pinks and yellows, the pinks being British India, the yellows being Indian India or the princely states. And in fact, the states, they covered about 2/5 of the landmass and encompassed about a third of the population. So we have somewhere around about 90 million subjects were under princely rule. And there were 562 states, which is, it's a number that's almost mind-boggling, hard to get around.
This is very, very hard to wrap your brain around.
Yeah, and I think that there was something like 300 of these states were micro-states, considered to be micro-states. So most of these were in, some of them were in central India, but most of them were in what is now Gujarat. And there were a couple of these states were, there was one state, Junagadh, which I think the area was something like 3/4 of a square mile for your American listeners, or just a couple of square kilometers for those who know the metrics, and population sometimes just numbering in the hundreds, and the revenue that these states generated, again, numbering in maybe thousands of rupees at the time. But then there were the giant states like Baroda, Kashmir, Hyderabad, of course, Mysore. These were also the 21-gun salutes states. So the British organized this hierarchy, which encompassed about 140-odd states, giving them different status, almost like a caste system, ranging from 9 guns up to 21. And 21 sounds like a lot, but the viceroy would get 31-gun salutes if he arrived in Delhi, whereas the king emperor would get 100 guns. So, but it was very important, and states would were constantly lobbying the political department to raise their gun salute status, thinking that they had been hard done by. But the other thing that we should mention is that these states were sovereign states. They were the British looked after their defense and external affairs, but the princes, the rulers, had sole authority over their internal affairs. This was a cost-efficient and risk-averse model for the British, because they didn't have to take over the administration of these states. These states were bound to the British by treaties or sanads, which were kind of like conventions, or they had some sort of recognized relationship with the paramount power, with the British. But it meant that the British could allow these states to administer themselves without incurring any costs to them, and the states, in fact, paid sort of tributes to the British. So it was a win-win situation for both sides. But it also meant that the rulers of these states had pretty much power of life and death over their subjects, even if the ruler of that state might only rule over a dozen or so villages, or in the case of a state like Hyderabad, rule over a state the size of a modern European country like Belgium, with 16 million inhabitants and an income on par with, the top 20 countries of the world at that time.
I want to ask you about the Congress Party and the Congress Party's orientation or position on the princes, because in the early part of the 20th century, as you note, the Congress adopted a policy basically of non-intervention. Insofar as the princely states were concerned, they thought it would be unwise, they thought it would be foolish to intervene excessively in their affairs. But by 1938, you write, the Congress basically reversed course. I believe they put out a statement saying that they wanted to extend the same freedoms in the princely states as they wanted to bring about in the rest of India. What was it that changed the Congress's position on this?
Yeah, that's right. At first, Congress, as you said, didn't want to involve itself in the affairs of the states because it would leave the party fighting on two fronts, with the British and with the princes. And this also could result in the government of India lending rulers even greater support and thereby strengthening princely rule. There were several factors that led to this change. One was the repression by certain princes of what was happening in those states. And I'll just give you one example, which was in Alwar, which is a state in what is now Rajasthan, where up to about 500 unarmed farmers and protesters were massacred by the state troops for protesting against hikes in the land taxes that they had to pay. Now, even though Gandhi described this as the worst massacre since the Amritsar massacre of 1919, but the British government refused to depose the ruler because the princes had autonomy over their internal affairs, and only in cases of the most gross misrule could a ruler be deposed. So this was one case, which was shocked Congress and shocked many others, even in British India. And then you also had the setting up of something called the All India States People's Conference in the late 1920s. And this was a body which was kind of monitoring the situation in some of these princely states. And in 1929, I think it was, it came out with something called the Indictment of Patiala. Now, Patiala was one of the, I think it was a 19-gun salute state in what is now Punjab, and its ruler, Bhupinder Singh, was also the Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes. Now, this document, the Indictment of Patiala, had a huge amount of evidence describing some of the worst possible atrocities that could have been committed by a ruler against his people. I mean, he was accused of rape, of murdering his wife, of burning their son, of raping women. There was the evidence that it presented against Bhupinder Singh was pretty conclusive, but again, the British refused to intervene. So there was a lot of obviously growing discontent with this policy of Congress not to intervene in the states. But the final trigger was the arrest of Congress workers in Mysore in 1938, when they raised the Indian flag on January 26th, which was the date that had been demarcated as Independence Day, a future Independence Day. So this triggered a change in Congress policy, and the Congress Working Committee authorized workers to directly assist the peoples of the states to struggle for responsible government. But this agitation was fairly short-lived, because once it led to protests, which were in some cases put down by the rulers of the states, and in other cases spun out of control. I think you had a political agent in one of the Chhattisgarh states being killed. So it was Mahatma Gandhi, who called an end to this satyagraha, to this campaign of non-cooperation, because he was for non-violence, and this movement was becoming incredibly violent in some of the states. But I think it was it certainly politicized the subjects of these states, but it was also a wake-up call to the rulers, because they realized that if Congress had this power to unleash popular sentiment against them, and if it wasn't for the protection of the British, they would lose power. And this was the shadow hanging over the princes in the lead up to independence, when they realized that a Congress-led government, post-independence Congress-led government, would not have the interests of perpetuating princely rule at the core of its ideology.
When the British decided upon the partition of the subcontinent, then Viceroy Lord Mountbatten made a complex situation even more complicated by preponing, as the Indians would say, the date of India's independence by a full year, up to, of course, August 15th, 1947. And I think Mountbatten made this announcement in late May of that year, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about the key players on the Indian side who were tasked with, creating a nation out of this very complicated patchwork in just about 10 weeks' time. Who are the key protagonists?
Sure. It was early June, it was 3rd of June that he made the announcement that preponing independence. And of course, Mountbatten arrived in India in March 1947. The princes thought that as a blue-blooded royal, he would have their best interests at heart. In fact, the king told him that he had to look after India's most loyal allies, as he described them. But Mountbatten had, he was trying to prepare India for independence, and just made his job a lot harder by preponing it, as you said. Look, he really left the problem of the states far too late. We can talk about that as well. But the main protagonists in this curtain call for the princely states were Conrad Caulfield, who was the head of the political department and the chief advisor to Mountbatten on the princely states. He had been first come to India in the 1920s and had served first with the Indian Civil Service and then with the political department. And so he was very close to a lot of the leaders of the princely states and was really championing their rights to. He was on the one hand telling them to prepare for independence by introducing administrative and constitutional reforms, but he was also telling them that they should stand up for their rights, and the rights that the princes had was to ultimately decide their future for themselves. That meant either joining India or Pakistan or declaring their independence. This was something which sent shivers down the spines of Congress leaders, notably Vallabhbhai Patel, who was Home Minister at the time, Congress strongman, head kicker, fundraiser, a Gujarati, now hailed by the BJP government as being the real man who integrated India, who built India really, created what is now the modern nation state, and I think, and he's honoured with this highest statue and tallest statue in the world, which is something like 600 feet tall in Gujarat, which is I think twice the size of the Statue of Liberty, and he is called the Bismarck of India for getting the states to become part of the Indian Union. So Patel was born in 1875 in Gujarat. He studied at the bar. He became a disciple of Mahatma Gandhi in 1918. joined him in a number of satyagrahas that Gandhi started in Gujarat over the unjust collection of taxes. He became, in 1921, he arranged the annual meeting of Congress in Ahmedabad, which was a kind of turning point for the Congress, which transformed it into a mass movement. And so he was instrumental in that process, a very important process. And he was very much involved in the states as well. States like Rajkot, where there was again a movement against Congress that the then ruler started in the 1930s. Patel very much saw the states as a impediment to India's march to freedom, because these were autocracies, they were undemocratic. So Patel was very much aware that unless the states democratized, unless they introduced constitutional reforms, they would be an impediment to India's march to freedom. The other main architect of the accession and integration of the states was V.P. Menon. Now, he's really an extraordinary character, and while, as I said, Patel is often termed the Bismarck of India for getting all these disparate states to join the Indian Union, Menon was very much the architect of the accession process. Now, he was the son of a schoolmaster. He was born in the late 1890s in Kerala. He famously left home, or ran away from home, after burning down part of his school because he had a disagreement with the headmaster, who thought that he was not pulling his weight in class. He caught the very first train that was passing through his town, which happened to be going to the Kolar goldfields in what is now Karnataka. So he got a job there as a coolie, basically working for a couple of annas a day, doing hard physical work in the mines. But there managed to work his way up through the mine hierarchy and became an overseer until he was sacked for allowing his workers to slacken off on the job. But he impressed his overseer, his boss at the mine, who recommended that he get a job in the Indian government, which he did. And he, over the decades, he worked his way up, starting as a typist, as a clerk, and then working as a stenographer in the Reforms branch, which later became the Reforms Commission. So he was an extremely hard worker, and his lucky break came in 1940 when he was the Undersecretary in the Reforms Commission, which was set up by the Viceroy Lord Linlithgow. And H.V. Hodgson, who was the Reforms Commissioner, recommended him as his replacement. So that meant that Menon, who had started off as I said, a coolie in the Kolar goldfields, was now the most senior Indian bureaucrat in the Raj, because this was an extremely important and senior position. He served as Reforms Commissioner for Linlithgow, for Wavell, and then for Mountbatten. And it was also Menon who came up with the plan to partition India, the so-called Menon-Mountbatten plan, which was put together in May 1947. So so he was certainly a very important, sort of underrated figure in many ways. There's one decent biography of Menon, which is written by his grandniece, Narayani Basu, a very good book. But and as I said, Menon wrote The Integration of the Princely States and another book on the transfer of power. But otherwise, his role in really creating the modern Indian state, I think is vastly underrated compared to Patel's.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. You mentioned earlier, you alluded to the Indian political department, and I found this statistic to be pretty shocking. You write that in 1947, the size of the Indian political service, which managed relations between the Crown and the princely states, was just 124 officers strong, 90 of whom were British. How did such a small crew manage this, and what happened to this unit when August 15th, 1947 came about?
Sure. I mean, it is, the numbers appear to be incredibly small, but then you've got to remember that there were, at that same time, the time of independence, there were only 980 officers in the Indian civil service, which was tasked with basically, that was the Raja's administrative arm. Of which about half were Europeans. So, that's, less than 1,000 officers administering a country of 300 million people. So that puts the numbers in perspective. But it is remarkable, and the Indian political service. I mean, it was, probably the most romantic of the two, because these were officers who usually came up from the ranks of the Indian civil service, but were singled out for their ability, firstly, say, to their knowledge of vernacular languages, they tended to be people who enjoyed sport, pig sticking or polo. They were sensitive to local customs and etiquette. There was one, I think it was Harcourt Butler, who was a senior ICS officer, said in, I think, the 1920s that we want lean and keen men on the frontier and fat and good-natured men in the States. So that was what made them stand out. But look, I've read numerous files which describe the lives of these political agents, as they were known. So basically, the larger states had British residents. There were about a dozen of them, who were almost like ambassadors representing the crown, and were the conduit between the rulers and the India office. And then under them were political agents who had under their watch sometimes dozens of small states, which they would visit maybe a couple of times a year, and they'd report back to London on the administrative standards and what was happening succession-wise, and on if there was any scandals that needed to be kept quiet or dealt with in some cases. And these are fascinating documents, very, very colourful, often. But you get a feeling. But by and large, you get a feeling for the affinity, the empathy that these political officers had for the states and their rulers, and of course they would be feted by the princes. They would be taken on tiger hunts. They would be, entertained with performances of Nautch dancing in the evenings in these attar-scented palaces. So you can imagine the strong relationships that they formed. Which was, in a sense, also detrimental to the process of reform in these states, because they were prevented by there was no incentive for them to demand that these rulers reformed their administrations. They were in fact told that non-intervention was the best policy to adopt, unless it was only when misrule reached a pitch that violated the elementary laws of civilization could a ruler be deposed. And then this is a very a term which could be interpreted in numerous ways, and as it turned out, very few of the rulers reached this point of violating laws of civilization, which led to their them being packed off, so it was, but it was a small cadre, but it was a very effective one. And Conrad Caulfield, who I mentioned before, who was head of the political department, as soon as Attlee in early 1947 announced a timetable for Britain's withdrawal, which was originally going to be in June 1948, he started the task of dismantling the political department. And one of the things that he oversaw was the destruction of tons and tons of confidential documents on the private lives of these princes, because he believed that had these documents gotten into the hands of India's new rulers, they could be used to blackmail the princes. But of course, when Mountbatten brought forward the date for independence by 10 months, Caulfield was suddenly, his best laid plans for transition to an Indian-led administration was, of course, made very, very difficult. And in the end, he resigned rather than see it to its ultimate conclusion. But basically, after independence, there was no more political department. There was no more Indian political service, and the political department had been replaced by an Indian-run states ministry, which took the process to its conclusion.
I have to ask you about some specifics here, and particularly I want to ask you about the struggle for Junagadh's succession. I have to ask you about it because this is where my father is from, and I remember from Ram Guha's book, India After Gandhi, that famously the Nawab of Junagadh was known for spending the state's riches on the marriage of his two favorite dogs. And as a dog person, it sounds like you're a dog person too. I can sort of almost understand that. But some of the personalities involved here in this dispute and accession are really fascinating, as is the role played by a very prominent member of the famous Bhutto family of Zulfikar and Benazir Bhutto. Tell us a little bit about the Junagadh standoff and how it was resolved ultimately.
Yeah, so the Bhutto you're referring to is Shah Nawaz Bhutto, who was the Diwan of Junagadh, the Maharaja, or the Nawab, because it was a Muslim state ruling over a Hindu majority population, was Mahabat Khan. And yes, he did spend an inordinate amount of the state's budget on diamond-studded collars for his various hounds. But it was, and Junagadh, of course, being a princely state in what is now Gujarat on the southern coast. So it had a seaport. It was surrounded mostly by other states, and it was a Muslim-ruled state with a Hindu majority population. Something like 85% of the population were Hindus. And this was not unusual. There was at least a dozen other states similar to Junagadh, including Hyderabad, that had Muslim rulers and Hindu majority populations. But Junagadh, rather than in most of the states, did sign instruments of accession. and as you said, this was a process which was accomplished in just weeks. So Mountbatten, Menon, and Patel managed to arm twist the states to sign these instruments, which would give India control over defence, external affairs, and communications, but otherwise leave the internal administration of these states untouched. Junagadh's instrument was never received, and just at the time of independence, Mahabat Khan announced that Junagadh was going to accede to Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, the distance between the border of Pakistan and Junagadh was roughly 300 miles or something like that. So there was not a contiguous boundary there. But Junagadh was within its legal rights to accede. This had been guaranteed in the Indian Independence Act. So there's really nothing much India could do about it except to protest. Pakistan was slow in accepting Junagadh's accession, mainly because Jinnah was too busy trying to get a new state established out of the ashes of partition, a traumatic and bloody period of history. But eventually it did accept Junagadh's accession. Now, the problem was that Junagadh's accession to Pakistan set a worrying precedent because you had Hyderabad, which was another Muslim-ruled state with a Hindu majority population. So if India accepted Junagadh's accession to Pakistan, it would also set a precedent for Hyderabad. And also Kashmir was another state that whose Maharaja Hari Singh was equivocating as to whether to join India or Pakistan. While India stopped short of intervening militarily, there was obviously a lot of pressure to do something because to have Junagadh as a part of Pakistan within Indian territory was simply unacceptable. So it massed its troops on the border. There was also a provisional government formed, and it too sent its supporters towards Junagadh. There was also discontent among the Hindu majority population of the state. And so eventually Mahabat Khan realized that his time was up, gathered together some of his prized Pekingese, several of his wives, cleaned out the treasury, and boarded a plane for Karachi. So at that time, Shah Nawaz Bhutto, who was the Diwan of the state, invited India to take over the administration. And this was followed by a plebiscite, which, interestingly enough, Nehru wanted, but Patel opposed. Patel opposed the idea of having a plebiscite because he realized that if you have India allows a plebiscite in Junagadh, even though India was sure that it would win because overwhelmingly the population of Hindus would vote for remaining in India, it would make it very difficult to oppose Pakistan's demands for a plebiscite in Kashmir, which had a majority Muslim population, and if one was held, it could well lead to the population of Kashmir opting to join Pakistan. So there was a plebiscite, and it was one of those 99.9% of the population voting to stay in within India, but it's something that Pakistan has never recognized. And if you look at a map of modern Pakistan today, you will find colored in green Junagadh as still being considered part of Pakistan.
I was struck by that on the one and only time I've been to Pakistan, which was now almost 20 years ago. And when I sat in some, very dimly lit kind of dank government office, and you look up at the map on the wall, and as an inset, kind of in the corner, they have Junagadh blown up, right, as showing it as part of Pakistani territory. And as you point out in the book, the case of Junagadh was eventually taken to the UN because of this dispute. Pakistan said, look, neither the Divan nor the Nawab had the authority to negotiate a settlement with India. And I think technically speaking, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it still remains somewhere buried on the UN agenda.
It does, yes.
Which is kind of
as does the Kashmir.
Correct.
Yes.
I had never really, I have to admit, focused on the fact that the instruments of accession that the princes signed were pretty minimalist in nature, right? They basically said, look, the new Union of India would be in charge of foreign affairs, defense, communications. All other subjects would rest with the princes themselves. It was only later that the princes were asked to sign these merger arrangements that fully brought them into the Union. And it was as part of the latter, they were guaranteed their so-called privy purses. Tell us a little bit about kind of what the sequence of events was in terms of how they incorporated these. Right? Accession was really just the first step in this process.
That's right. As you said, the states still had the right to look after their internal affairs. So what you had at the time of independence was still this checkerboard of states scattered all over India, with some of the rulers had taken steps to introduce constitutional reforms, had extended franchise to most of the population, had taken steps to introduce administrative reforms as well. But aside from the bigger states, there was really no. It would just be impossible for India to survive as a unified country with these small outposts of autocracy still scattered around the country. Now, Patel and Menon realized that this was just an unviable situation. And so they very quickly realized that the only way for India to survive as an independent nation was to have these states integrate with the Indian Union. So this was the second part of this process. You had accession, and now you had to have integration. And that meant the states would have to give up their control over their internal affairs, which had been guaranteed in these instruments of accession. So they were in fact breaking promises that had been made only a few months earlier to get these states over the line. Now, Menon and Patel argued that, India had just gone through this traumatic period of partition, hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions and millions displaced. So India could not afford to have this situation on its hands. So they started with some of the smaller states and got them to merge either with existing provinces, as was the case in Orissa and Chhattisgarh, or to merge into new units, as was the case in places like what is now Madhya Pradesh, where you had big states like Indore and Gwalior merging with maybe a dozen smaller states to form Madhya Pradesh. In Rajasthan, you had about a dozen different Rajput states, which were eventually merged into what is now Rajasthan. But again, that process of integration, which involved a lot of, in some cases, arm twisting, in some cases, threats of intervention, military, or that there would be some sort of takeover of their administrations. This process was again a violation of the promises that they had made, because Menon and Patel had promised some of the larger states like Jaipur, like Mysore, like Gwalior, which that they would remain separate entities. I mean, these were considered states of considerable size, some of which had modern administrations. So there was no reason really why you couldn't have a state of Jaipur or Gwalior Baroda, for instance. There was no reason why they would have to merge with neighbouring states. So again, but by 1949, all of these states had in fact been forced to merge with other states. So the map of India between 1947 and 1950, when this process had been completed, changed multiple times. I mean, it would have been a cartographer's nightmare. I mean, even a state like Rajasthan went through maybe several iterations before it became what we now know as Rajasthan. So it was a messy process. In some cases, it was a bloody process, as we saw in Hyderabad, which had declared its independence until it was forced to merge with the Indian Union after the police action of September 1948, which saw tens of thousands of people killed. Menon and Patel described this process as bloodless, which it wasn't, as voluntary, which it wasn't. In all cases, some cases it was, but in a lot of cases it wasn't. In fact, in some of the rulers of what had been small states in Chhattisgarh and Orissa were later discovered to be plotting against Congress, even plotting for the party's overthrow because they were so unhappy with the terms of the merger agreements. And it was a very messy process. The quid pro quo for the states was to what the states were offered in return for integrating with the Indian Union, for merging with together with neighbouring provinces, were these privy purses and privileges. So depending on the size of the state, they would get a set privy purse calculated on what would have been the state's income before independence. The rulers would have the right to diplomatic privileges such as importing their Rolls Royces, flying flags on their bonnets, having their own flag, keeping most of their properties, their palaces, their titles, and a slew of other sort of sweeteners to keep them on side. And these were guaranteed in the Constitution under articles of the Constitution. So this was so the rulers were given these inducements to integrate, and that's pretty much how they managed to get them across the line.
So just to kind of fast forward, and maybe this is a good way to kind of bring the conversation to a close. Indira Gandhi ultimately decided to amend the Constitution, revoke the privy purses that the princes enjoyed. As you mentioned, this guarantee was an essential part of the quid pro quo between the Union and the various princes across the country. Tell us a little bit about why she was so dead set on this act. Was it just a way for her to deflate the Swatantra Party, which, of course, gained a lot of support from the former princes, or was there a deeper motivation at play?
Look, she inherited a lot of her bias against the princes from her father, but she also came into power in she'd been in power for about a year before the 1967 elections, which saw Congress as worst performance since independence. And part of the reason for its worst performance was the fact that a considerable number of princes had entered politics, mostly in opposition to Congress. Some of them stood for the Swatantra Party. I'll give you just one example. Maharani Gayatri Devi of Jaipur. She she made the Guinness Book of Records by winning her seat by a record 175,000 votes. And she had no political experience at all. But it was because she came from the royal family. People just voted for her in vast numbers, and
you know a little something about her, don't you?
Yeah, I know. My previous book was on the House of Jaipur, was on on the Jaipur royal family. She died about 20 years ago, but I've met her son and other members, and some of the family's other branches as well. So I think there was the princes enjoyed something like an 80% success rate. So if you had a prince running for your party, you were almost guaranteed of getting your candidate elected. Now, of course, Indira Gandhi was, there was a meeting of the All India Congress Committee straight after the election to do a post-mortem of why the party had done so badly. And the fact that the princes were so popular was singled out as one of the reasons for Congress's poor performance. But Gandhi also realized that if she was going to improve her party's chances, she needed a populist nationalist agenda. And so privy purses and bank nationalization were two of the planks that she went to the next elections with. And the abolition of the privy purses and privileges went on to become part of Congress policy in a kind of surreptitious way. It's interesting how it was done. There was a faction of Congress known as the Young Turks, and one of the leaders of that faction, who was from Maharashtra, his name was Mohan Daria, moved a motion at a late night session of the Congress committee when everybody else had gone to bed, basically, and there was only, I think, 20 or so Congress members there. Indira Gandhi wasn't there, to approve this motion to abolish the privy purses, part of Congress policy. I think the motion passed 17 votes to 4. The princes put up a pretty pathetic fight. They formed something called Rulers of Indian States in Concord for India. You had people like Sohaiman Singh of Jaipur, Gayatri Devi's husband, lobbying Mountbatten to get the government to put pressure on India to not to abolish the privy purses and privileges. But it was a purely populist measure, because at the time the cost of the privy purses amounted to about 0.2% of India's annual budget. And as the Maharana of Udaipur remarked, the amount was so pitiful it wouldn't buy every Indian a picture postcard. But still, it was there. It was part of her populist agenda. She won the next election with a thumping majority, with the necessary 2/3 majority to amend the constitution, which she finally did in December 1971. Lok Sabha and then the Rajya Sabha, the lower and upper houses of India's parliament, voted to change the constitution, and the articles that had guaranteed these privy purses and privileges became history. And that was basically the end of the princely order.
My guest on the show this week is the author John Zabriskie. His most recent book is called Dethroned: Patel, Menon, and the Integration of Princely India. John, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. I often go back to Ram Guha's book, India After Gandhi, and the parts I go back to are the parts about the princely states because I find them to just be the most engrossing. And so for you essentially to, blow that up into a full-fledged book and bringing out all the richness and detail and characters and frankly, quirkiness of some of these developments was really a treat for me. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the book and talk about, this fascinating topic.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.